She stepped into the courtroom like a shadow returning home. Not for glory, not for fame, but for justice, raw, unfinished, and overdue. Eleanor Washington, once a legendary civil rights attorney, had long since laid down her sword, retreating to a quiet life where the battles of her past whispered through yellowed case files and framed verdicts. But today, she came back, not as a relic, but as a reckoning. Before her stood a grieving black mother, her face worn by nights without sleep, her eyes hollowed by loss too heavy for words. Her son was dead, another name in the ever-growing ledger of silence. Another soul claimed by a system designed to erase. Eleanor didn't come back for closure. She came back because the weight of her silence had grown too loud to bear. Across the aisle stood Ethan Brooks, young, polished, full of himself, the firm's golden boy with courtroom swagger and a smile sharpened like a blade. He didn't recognize her at first. To him, she was just another old woman clinging to the last pieces of a fading era. But what he didn't see, what no one had told him, was that Eleanor had once saved his entire world without ever raising her voice. 20 years ago, she stood between his family and the street. When they were poor, voiceless, and nearly invisible, she fought for them, not with fury, but with the calm clarity of someone who understood the system better than the men who built it. That day, she handed young Ethan the first spark of dignity he'd ever known. And then she disappeared. And now, here he was, a man who had built a career out of burying people like the woman who had once saved him. Eleanor could see it in his eyes, the ambition, the charm, the carefully constructed armor of a man who had learned how to win but forgotten why justice mattered. But she had not forgotten. The courtroom was not just a battleground, it was a haunted house. Echoing with verdicts that had broken families, policies that wore the mask of fairness but hid the rot of prejudice beneath. As the judge called the room to order, Eleanor didn't rush, she didn't posture, she simply stood there, spine straight, folder in hand, and looked directly into Ethan's eyes, not with hatred, not even with disappointment, but with quiet memory. She didn't need to shout. Her presence said everything. I know who you were. I know what you became. And I am not afraid of what you represent. Outside, the world carried on, unaware that within these walls, an old battle had reignited, not just over evidence or arguments, but over truth itself. Eleanor wasn't here to play the game. She was here to burn down the board. And Ethan, though too proud to admit it, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Something in him stirred, not guilt, not yet, but recognition. He remembered the boy he once was, sitting in a pew with polished shoes and too many questions, and the woman who bent down to tell him that the law would never love him, but if he was smart and brave and careful, maybe one day he could make it fair. That day had come, and the question was no longer whether justice would win. It was whether Ethan Brooks still remembered how to stand for it. The boy sat in the courtroom like a statue carved from fear, 12 years old, drowning in a shirt that pinched at the collar and shoes too shiny to feel real. Surrounded by echoes of gavel strikes and adult voices that spoke in legal riddles he didn't yet understand. His mother sat beside him, trembling not from guilt but from exhaustion, clutching the remains of hope like a fraying ribbon. The white landlord's lawyer, sleek and merciless, rattled off lease violations and legal codes as if they were gospel, demanding they vacate their apartment in 7 days. 7 days to disappear. 7 days to unravel a life stitched together by late shifts and prayers over gas bills. All it took was one missed paycheck after the factory cut her hours, and now her dignity was being bartered in front of strangers who didn't know her name. The lawyer called it a breach of contract. The boy just called it life. Then she walked in, not loudly, not in dramatic protest, but with a stillness that rearranged the room. Her name was Eleanor Washington. No robe, no entourage, no briefcase, just a neatly tied bun, a beige cardigan, and a single folder held against her chest like scripture. But there was something about her, something in the way she carried herself that made even the judge lean forward in his seat. Curious and alert, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand attention. Instead, she spoke with the quiet conviction of someone who had seen the system's underbelly and returned with the vocabulary to expose it. She cited cases, questioned motives, and peeled back the cold language of policy to reveal its true shape: discrimination hidden beneath layers of neutrality. With each word, she reframed the story. The boy's mother wasn't a defaulter. She was a worker in crisis. She wasn't lazy. She was surviving. And somehow, against the odds, Eleanor won. The judge ruled in their favor, and the boy's family got to keep their home. But what lingered in the boy's mind long after the ruling wasn't just the victory, it was her. The way she moved like she belonged in that courtroom. The way her eyes softened when she looked at his mother. And most of all, the way she bent down outside the courthouse steps, met his gaze without condescension, and said words that stitched themselves into his future. The law won't love you, son, but if you're smart, careful, and brave, maybe one day you can make it fair. He didn't fully understand it then, but something inside him shifted, crystallized. That brief moment, so unassuming, so human, became a cornerstone, a seed planted not with grandeur, but with quiet power. And as the years passed, and life twisted him into sharper shapes, that memory stayed, buried perhaps, but never erased. 20 years later, that boy had become a man sculpted by ambition, dressed in power like a second skin. Ethan Brooks stood before the mirror in the courthouse bathroom, adjusting a silk tie that cost more than his mother's rent used to, smoothing his perfect hair, checking his flawless smile, the one calibrated to charm juries and silence critics. His reflection didn't show the boy who once trembled on a courtroom bench. That boy had been locked away long ago, replaced by the youngest partner at Patterson & Wells, the firm's prized defender of police departments and the status quo. Ethan had learned not just how to navigate the system, but how to bend it in his favor, every closing argument a performance, every victory a line on his resume. Today's case was no different. He thought, another grieving black family, another tragic narrative to dismantle with precision and polish. He smirked at his reflection, whispered like a prayer to his ego, "They always want someone to blame, and I'm always the one who makes that go away." He didn't know, not yet. He didn't know that the opposing counsel he was so ready to dismiss, the one whose name hadn't yet appeared on the docket, the one he joked might be some relic from the civil rights era with a Rolodex full of ghosts, was none other than Eleanor Washington. The woman who once spoke truth into his life before he even understood what truth meant. She hadn't come with theatrics or headlines. She came armed with memory and a folder that weighed more than paper ever could. As Ethan strolled through the marble halls of the courthouse, soaking in the admiring glances and reverent nods from guards and interns alike, his coat fluttering behind him like a cape, he wore the arrogance of a man too successful to question whether he still had a soul. Cameras clicked. Reporters chuckled at his whispered digs. His assistant hung on every smug word, yet underneath the swagger, the ground had already begun to shift. Because what waited for him inside that courtroom wasn't just a legal opponent. It was a reckoning. And when Eleanor finally stepped through those courtroom doors, straight-backed and unshaken, the temperature in the room changed. No one announced her, no fanfare, just presence, the kind of presence that makes men forget their scripts and remember their sins. Ethan didn't blink at first, but something behind his eyes flickered, a memory, a ghost, the echo of a voice that once knelt beside him and told him the law wasn't made to love people like them. But maybe, just maybe, it could be made to protect them. He buried it fast, turned away, adjusted his cufflinks, cracked another joke. But the past doesn't care about appearances. It waits, it remembers. And Eleanor Washington was not here for nostalgia. She was here for justice. Ethan just didn't know yet. He wasn't the hero of this story. He was its test. Across town, far from the polished floors and practiced smiles of the courthouse, in a modest brick house where paint peeled like tired skin and the garden had once bloomed with the bright defiance of hope, Lisa Wallace stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blouse for the third time. Her fingers trembled, not because she cared how she looked, but because today, her brother's name would finally be spoken in court. Not as a statistic, not as a suspect, but as a human being. Behind her, Margaret Wallace, her mother, sat silently at the kitchen table, flipping slowly through a Bible so worn its pages had softened into fabric. Its edges curled from years of prayer and grief. Her face was a map of strength carved by struggle, lines etched not by bitterness, but by endurance. Lisa turned toward her, voice barely more than a breath. "Mama, what if they tear him apart in there? What if they say things we can't fight back against?" Margaret didn't look up. She simply placed one hand gently on the Bible and said, "They already took him from us. Baby, all that's left now is his truth. And the truth can fight for itself. If we're brave enough to carry it." Lisa nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, summoning strength she wasn't sure she had. Then came the knock, soft, steady, almost sacred in its rhythm. Margaret rose first, and when she opened the door, time seemed to bend. There, framed by the morning light, stood Eleanor Washington, not as a legend, not as a lawyer, but as a witness to grief, a vessel for justice. She wore a deep navy coat, buttoned to the collar, her silver hair pulled back into its usual bun, eyes calm yet piercing. She carried no heavy case files, no entourage, only a slim leather folder pressed close to her chest like a heartbeat. Lisa stared at her, all softening her features. "You're her," she whispered, "the one Reverend Mitchell said fought the city and won." Eleanor offered a faint smile, the kind that carried both warmth and sorrow. "I fought a few fights," she replied, "lost some, won some, but this one matters." Margaret stepped aside instinctively, clearing the table the way mothers do when warriors enter their homes. Eleanor sat with the grace of someone who had stared down power and never blinked. She opened her folder, not to unleash a flood of legal jargon, but to speak in truths too often buried beneath procedure. "They'll paint Terence as a threat," she said, voice low and certain. "They'll twist his story, question his worth, smile while they do it. Our job isn't just to present the facts. It's to remind them he was loved, that his life meant something." Lisa's lips quivered. "Can we win this?" she asked, clinging to the thread of possibility. Eleanor closed the folder and looked her in the eye. "That depends," she said quietly. "Are you ready to stop being afraid of their lies, and start standing for your truth?" And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a torch lit not by hope alone, but by resolve. Outside, the world kept spinning. Inside, three women sat at a table once covered in family dinners and overdue bills, now set for war. And somewhere in the stillness, the spirit of Terence Wallace breathed, not as a ghost of tragedy, but as a call to courage. The courthouse buzzed like a nest unsettled, the air thick with the low hum of whispered speculation and the static crackle of camera flashes bouncing off marble walls, reporters clustering by courtroom B, interns clinging to their clipboards, guards standing a little too straight, as if even they could sense the storm brewing behind polished doors. Ethan Brooks moved through the chaos like royalty returning to his throne. Coat swaying behind him, eyes sharp, posture perfected, untouchable, or so he believed. He glanced at the opposing counsel's table, smirked at its emptiness, and leaned over to his assistant, letting his words slip just loud enough for the nearby reporters to catch. Probably some bleeding heart civil rights relic with a law degree from the 60s and a Rolodex full of ghosts. Laughter followed, the kind that filled space with arrogance, not joy. Cameras clicked, notes were scribbled, and Ethan adjusted his cufflinks like they were medals earned in battle. He turned to the crowd, nodding to familiar faces, knowing they saw not just a man, but a brand. "I'll have this wrapped before lunch," he quipped. But across the city, in a house too humble for news vans or courtrooms, justice was preparing herself, not with fury, but with stillness. Lisa Wallace stood in her brother's old bedroom, surrounded by the echoes of who he had been, basketball posters still clinging to faded walls, his college acceptance letter taped above a scratched desk, a photo of them together, laughing with ice cream cones in hand. the memory too alive to ignore. On the bed beside her sat a cardboard box, given back to the family after the case had been closed. Inside, a cracked phone, an empty wallet, a bent chain necklace, and a sticky note in Terence's handwriting, just one word, backup, followed by a string of random characters. Lisa's heart stopped, her hands shook. Terence had always been cautious, always 2 steps ahead of the danger he sensed but could never outrun. She grabbed his old laptop, typed in the code from the sticky note, and the screen blinked to life. Meanwhile, Ethan, high above the city in his apartment of glass and steel, loosened his tie, poured a drink, and listened to a voicemail that carved the first crack in his armor. Brooks. Start taking this seriously. Washington's not nostalgia. She's a goddamn war veteran. She doesn't miss. He scoffed, at first, but then he remembered Judge Hanley, forced into early retirement after she exposed his backdoor deals. The police chief who resigned in disgrace after her civil rights lawsuit gutted his precinct. The voice on the line wasn't wrong. Eleanor Washington wasn't a memory. She was a reckoning that had returned. Ethan tossed back his drink, but it burned this time. Across the city, Lisa opened the folder labeled for Lisa. If something happens. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside, photos, screenshots, notes, timestamps, and a video clip. She clicked play. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to see. 3 officers, laughing, exchanging something with a man behind a grocery store dumpster. Plastic bags, rolled bills, a handshake too practiced to be innocent. Then the camera shook. Someone must have bumped the phone, and a voice, low and resigned, whispered, "No one's gonna believe this, man." Then the screen went black. Lisa stared, frozen. Her brother had caught something, proof. And now he was dead. Her hands trembled, but her resolve solidified. She picked up the phone, and with a voice barely above a whisper, called Eleanor. "Miss Washington, I found it. I think this is why they killed him." And across town, Ethan made a call of his own, voice tight with something new, dread. "The case isn't clean anymore," he said to the chief. "She's digging. And the girl, she's not as quiet as we thought." Silence on the other end. Then cold steel in a voice he'd come to fear. "Then clean it up," it said. Ethan hesitated. "And if she gets too close?" A long pause. Then, "You know what to do." The war had begun, not of words or courtroom strategy, but of truth against power, of memory against manipulation, of one family's pain against a system built to survive on silence. And somewhere beneath the courthouse where polished men laughed and cameras flashed, the walls began to tremble. The call came just after midnight. Slicing through the quiet like a blade through silk, Eleanor Washington. Still awake, still hunched over deposition records illuminated by the warm glow of a single desk lamp. Picked up the phone without hesitation. The voice on the other end was shaky, breathless, urgent. "Miss Washington, it's Taylor. Officer David Taylor. I can't carry this anymore." Her spine straightened. Her hand gripped the receiver tighter. "Are you safe?" she asked. But his pause was answer enough. "No, that's why I'm calling," he breathed. "I have files. Real ones. Internal reports. Backup footage. I hid them, but the department, they know I'm talking to someone. Please, meet me at the courthouse steps. Tomorrow, before the hearing." Her voice softened but never faltered. "David, be careful. Don't come alone." A heartbeat. Then a whisper, "If anything happens, tell the truth. That's all that matters." And then silence. The line cut. The connection gone, like a soul stepping off a cliff. The next morning, fog curled low around the courthouse plaza, and early reporters stood with coffee cups and tired eyes, waiting for the day's drama to unfold. But before Eleanor arrived, a scream tore through the morning stillness, sharp, sudden, slicing through the fog like lightning. Then sirens. Eleanor rushed forward just in time to see a black sedan speeding away from the curb, tires screeching against wet pavement. On the ground near the fountain lay David Taylor, blood blooming across his shoulder like a cruel flower. She pushed through the crowd, coat flaring behind her, but the paramedics were already there, already shaking their heads. Single shot. Professional, one murmured. Eleanor didn't speak. She simply stood there, watching as the zipped body bag swallowed a man who had risked everything to tell the truth, and paid the ultimate price. That night, the chapel was nearly empty. No brass eulogies, no media, just quiet grief. A few officers with hearts not yet hardened. A sister flown in from out of town. And Eleanor, alone at the back. Not near the casket, but by a side altar. She lit a candle beside a framed photo of David smiling nervously in uniform. And next to it, someone had placed an old newspaper clipping. Eleanor Washington wins landmark case against corrupt task force. 1992. She stared at her younger self in the yellowed ink, standing beside a man with brave eyes and a weary smile, her husband. He, too, had died not long after that case. They said it was a heart attack. But Eleanor had never believed that. Some truths, she had learned, are so dangerous they take your breath even after they're spoken. Her fingers, trembling but firm, lit another candle beside his. And the flames danced quietly in the still air, two lights, refusing to go out. And somewhere, not far from that small chapel and the echoes of unfinished justice, the gears of corruption turned faster, darker, but Eleanor didn't flinch. Grief had come knocking before. She had learned not just how to endure it, but how to turn it into fire. And tomorrow, she would return to court not just with a folder, but with a ghost on her shoulder and a promise in her chest. They tried to silence the truth. Now they would have to face it. Lisa Wallace sat in the dark, the only light coming from the television as breaking news flashed across the screen. Whistleblower officer shot outside courthouse. She didn't speak. Didn't blink, only stared, frozen, as her breath caught in her throat and her heart ached in places too deep for words. Beside her, Margaret placed a gentle hand on her daughter's back, offering comfort through touch when language failed. But Lisa barely felt it. Grief had hollowed her out, rage now rushing in to fill the silence. She had seen Officer David Taylor once before, at a quiet meeting with Eleanor, where his voice trembled but his conviction didn't. He had been scared, but kind, fractured but honest, and now he was gone, erased for daring to speak. They killed him, Lisa whispered, the truth cracking through her lips like thunder. Just like they killed Terrence. Just like they threatened us. Her voice cracked, but it didn't break. Instead, it sharpened into resolve. But they don't get to win again. She stood up, fists clenched. Tears carving lines down her face, not tears of helplessness, but of fury, of fire. I'm done hiding, done being quiet. Whatever Eleanor needs, I'm in. Margaret looked at her daughter, truly looked, and in Lisa's shaking shoulders and blazing eyes, she didn't just see pain, she saw Terrence. Not in memory, but in spirit, in the courage it takes to choose truth over safety. The streets outside their home were too quiet. Like the calm before a storm that had already begun. Lisa gripped the steering wheel of her rusted sedan, eyes flicking nervously between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. The dark SUV behind her had been following for 6 blocks. Never turning, never passing, just lingering, like a predator waiting for its moment. Her heart pounded like a drum in a war march. She made 3 rapid turns, one of Eleanor's tactics to shake a tail, but the SUV stayed with her. Tighter now, more aggressive. She fumbled for her phone. No signal. Panic rose in her throat like smoke. Then the headlights surged. The SUV sped forward, swerving alongside her, boxing her in. Lisa's instincts kicked in. She yanked the wheel hard to the right, turning into a narrow side alley slick with oil and rain. Her tires screamed in protest. The car skidding sideways toward a brick wall. She braced for impact. But before the crash, another vehicle appeared, a sleek car cutting across the alley like a knife through chaos. It wedged itself between Lisa's car and the SUV, forcing the tailing vehicle to swerve violently and slam into a dumpster with a metallic crunch. The SUV reversed fast, tires shrieking, and disappeared into the night. Lisa sat frozen, chest heaving, eyes wide, clutching the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Then the door of the rescue car opened, and out stepped Ethan Brooks. No smirk, no bravado, just a man in a long coat, breathing hard, rattled by something he didn't quite understand. "Are you all right?" he asked. Approaching her window, Lisa stared, disbelief mixing with fear. What are you doing here?" "I saw the car following you," he said quickly, glancing over his shoulder. "I knew it wasn't yours. And I don't like ambushes outside of court." His voice carried no arrogance, only urgency. She didn't answer. He checked the corners, scanning for movement, then leaned in closer. "This case? It's not just a trial anymore. Someone's turning it into a war." Lisa's voice wavered. "So you saved me because you care about justice?" Ethan paused, then looked her in the eye. "No," he said quietly, "because I care about winning. But I don't win like that." He turned to leave, but Lisa stepped out of her car, the glow of a nearby street lamp catching something in her hand, a thin silver chain, curled tightly in her fist, a cross dangling from it like a memory. Ethan stopped, staring. "That cross," he murmured, as if recognizing a ghost. "Where did you get that?" Lisa looked at him, confused. "My brother gave it to me last birthday. It used to be my mother's." Ethan blinked. The world tilted. He remembered that courtroom. The woman with the cross around her neck gripping her son's hand as the judge ruled in their favor. The woman who had changed everything. "Eleanor, you knew her?" Lisa asked. Ethan didn't answer. He just looked back at the cross. And for the first time, his eyes didn't hold calculation, they held something old. Something splintered. Something dangerously close to regret. Back in her apartment, Lisa told Eleanor everything, every terrifying second, every swerve of the car, every breathless moment in that alley when she thought her life might end, and Eleanor, composed as ever, listened with the precision of someone who had long since learned to find truth between trembling syllables. When Lisa finished, her voice frayed and thin. Eleanor leaned back slightly, eyes steady. "Do you trust him?" she asked, her tone unreadable. Lisa hesitated. "No," she admitted, "but I don't think he's as sure of himself as he used to be." Eleanor nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already suspected. "That's how all cracks start," she said softly, "one shaken belief at a time." And somewhere, alone in the hush of a sleek black car, Ethan Brooks replayed the moment in the alley, not the chase, not the danger, but the cross, that delicate silver cross clutched in Lisa's hand, shining under the street lamp like a sliver of the past come to haunt him. He couldn't stop seeing it, couldn't stop hearing the voice he had buried for decades. "The law won't love you, son, but maybe one day you can make it fair." That voice didn't belong to his reflection, or to his firm, or to the man he had trained himself to become. It belonged to her. Eleanor Washington. And now, the woman who once handed him his future had returned to take it back. The video Lisa had uncovered was short, under 2 minutes, but it hit like a wrecking ball. The alley, the dim light, the quiet laughter of uniformed officers trading bags of powder and rolls of cash with a man in plain clothes. The camera shook slightly, then caught Sergeant James Miller, his face lit for just a second by the glow of passing headlights, grinning like a man convinced he'd never be caught. Lisa didn't speak as she watched. She didn't cry. Instead, she backed the file up twice, once on a flash drive she buried under her dresser, once to a hidden cloud folder labeled Bible Notes, where no one would think to look. Then she called Eleanor, voice tight with adrenaline and purpose. "I found it," she said. "I think this is why they killed him." In Eleanor's office, the walls lined with worn books and decades of truth. She listened in silence, her fingers wrapped tightly around a chipped coffee mug, her knuckles white with fury she refused to let spill. "If we present this in court," she said slowly, "we don't just win this case, we tear a hole in everything they've tried to protect for years." Lisa's voice didn't shake. "Then we present it." Eleanor nodded. "We will," she promised, "but only when the timing leaves them no room to bury it." She stood and crossed to a shelf, pulling down an old leather binder, one of the kind kept not for law. but for war. Inside, she began adding names, timestamps, evidence chains, building a fortress of truth brick by brick. But she never got to finish. That night, while Eleanor met with a federal contact in a diner beneath flickering neon lights, her office was breached, no broken windows, no alarms tripped, just a brutal silence and drawers left yawning open like mouths mid-scream. Every sealed folder was gone. Her computer, ripped from its desk. Its hard drive vanished. The walls were empty except for one photograph left untouched. Her and her husband at a protest decades ago. Arms linked, smiles fierce, Eleanor stepped into the room, the scent of cold air and disturbed dust hanging thick, and said nothing. She simply stared, jaw tight, then reached for her phone. "Detective Chen," she said when he answered. "They've made their move. It's time I make mine." Across the city, Lisa sat on her bed, the weight of the flash drive heavy in her hand. They'd come for Eleanor. They would come for her. But fear no longer lived in her chest. Only fire.